Hello everybody, Charles here. So you might be wondering why I'm appearing to you guys now on screen, and that's because I recently hit 75,000 subscribers on my YouTube channel, and I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody who has subscribed over the last year and a half. It's been phenomenal. So I had originally intended to do something to celebrate some earlier milestones on my channel, in particular things like 10,000 subscribers, 25,000, 50,000. They all kind of passed me by. I either didn't have something ready when it came for the moment, or I was busy trying to sort out another video that I thought you guys might want to see first. So that's why I haven't really celebrated anything to this point, and that's why, strangely enough, I'm starting at 75,000 subscribers to do any sort of celebration. Making things more complicated is, by the time this video is going out, it looks like I will have passed 80,000 subscribers. So let's file off the serial numbers and just say, here's a nice video to commemorate hitting lots of subscribers. So you may have seen a couple of weeks ago, I put out a call for questions in order to do a little bit of a Q&A session for subscribers, and also for anyone who wanted to chime in on Twitter, and especially for people over on Patreon. So to warn you guys in advance, I have prioritized questions I received that were based on history or mythology, given those kind of now, I'd say, the two things that my channel is really focusing on. I did receive some very political questions, so I've gone ahead and nixed those. I'm not really a current affairs or politics-based channel, and I felt I wanted to keep the tone of this maybe a little bit more light-hearted. So apologies, guys, if your question didn't get answered as a result. Okay, so on with the show. My first couple of questions come here from Patreon. The first question is by Max Elisa. Elisa? Apologies, Max, I hope it was one of those. What was the single thing you learned about history that most inspired you to study it in depth? That's a good question. That's really difficult for me to narrow down to just one event, because I think it was more, I had a few events as a teenager that I just was aware how little I knew about world history. So I only did years 7 to 9 in the English schooling system, so that's between the ages of, I think, 11 to 13 or something like that, where I was having any history tuition at all. I didn't take it at GCSE, didn't take it at A-level, and my various university degrees that I wasted all my money and time on have nothing to do with history. So it's very much a recreational activity. If it came down to one event, I would say it would be something like getting access to Wikipedia in the mid-2000s and just realizing how much history of both the country I was living in and other countries that I was hearing about on the news I just was completely ignorant of. So there's things like, oh, I know what the current Queen of England is called, but I don't know what any of her predecessors were called. I don't know anything about these great periods of history that were really briefly touched upon in the few history classes I had. And yeah, that's probably what it is. And that sort of thing led to me doing kind of deep dives on Wikipedia, just going down big lists of like English and French and German monarchs. And eventually that kind of broadened out into a more how history as a time frame works and knits together with different countries interacting, rather than just the individual people involved. And that eventually morphed into more prehistory as well. So yeah, that was probably what led to me making 2 years worth of content now. Okay, moving on. Patricia asks, how do you think the people of Britain were affected by the Bronze Age collapse? Would you say it helped them rely on their own new innovations? Or were they not that involved in trade throughout the Mediterranean enough for it to have had a lasting effect? I think probably the latter. To the best of our knowledge, you don't really see like Greek designer goods appearing in Northern Europe until, the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. So things that I put in earlier videos, things like the Hockdorf Prince, for example. Yeah, that's the early point where you start seeing obviously Greek manufactured goods arriving. And that really had a lot to do with the foundation of Greek colonies along the edges of southern France and kind of on the eastern shores of Spain. Interestingly, Britain did go through something of an ecological collapse around the same time, it seems. I don't know how linked that is to events in the Mediterranean, but we did see large-scale changes in population, settlement patterns, and the way that bronze was being used as a commodity at the time. So it's interesting. There might be a little bit of something there connecting the two, just in terms of root causes, but I highly doubt the collapse of the Eastern Mediterranean nations that were producing bronze would have affected more native British bronze production at places like the Great Orme, Ross Island, and a whole bunch of other places whose names I cannot remember because it's been a while since I made that video. Okay, so we're moving across towards Twitter now, so let's have a look what people are asking here. The Mad Killer asks, do you love me? Yes. Platonically. Okay, so Mythology Guy asks, when are you going to start taking questions for the Q&A? Also, can we ask multiple questions? I like how you asked that on the tweet announcing the Q&A. Thank you. Great. But getting to his non-joke question, are there any stories you've come across in your research that stick out because they're funny, incredible, unbelievable, or you just like them? There's a whole bunch of little stories I've come across on just doing surface level research of different topics that I was considering at the time for videos. Unfortunately, I've not really gotten around to making videos on any of those topics for the simple reason that I thought the topic was too obscure for people to be that interested. There weren't many resources left visually that I could have used for those stories, and also because I was just busy already making a whole bunch of other videos. But to give a few examples, I would say maybe go on Wikipedia and Google Public Universal Friend. That's an interesting one. I think that's really cool. Basically, it was a story of a kind of Great Religious Awakening era preacher who developed their own big following at the time, and was probably one of the earliest examples that I've seen anyway of a trans person. So I would go away and look at that, Public Universal Friend. And just a fun one that I'd like to throw in there that's not so much history, it's like in the last 40 years, Google DB Cooper. That's a fun one. Okay, so I'm now going over to my phone to answer YouTube questions because I hadn't realised that YouTube community tabs don't work on tablets for some reason. Okay, so what do we got here? Tiffany asks, anything interesting happened 75,000 years ago? Congrats, and thank you for your time and effort spent sharing your own interests and passions with the rest of us. Oh, well, thank you, Tiffany. So I actually had to go away and have a look into this because I'm not that familiar when it comes to this period of human history. It's a little too early for the stuff that I normally read about. But what I found was it's theorized that a supervolcano eruption around 75,000 years ago may have caused a genetic bottleneck in the human population. So if you want to look into it more, feel free to go ahead. It's very controversial as far as I can tell whether or not this caused a vast reduction in the human population. I did see something about a study saying, we're still finding evidence of stone tools in volcanic ash layers immediately after this event. So it doesn't seem to have had that huge an event, but then you get other papers saying, yes, it seems to have been a significant change in the global climate as a result. So I don't really know about that one, but I thought that was a cool one for people to go ahead and start having a look at. Ben A asks, what is your favourite salmon-based lunch item? I'm glad you asked that one, Ben. I quite like salmon. I like having salmon more as like a dinner time thing. I like it, grilled. I like it pan-fried. It's good. But if I had to narrow it down and say I liked one particular type of salmon, I would have to go with former US Supreme Court Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase. John Stewart asks, I don't think it's the famous one, what got you into researching history? Well, I kind of went over this a little bit earlier with Max Alay's question, which was, it really was just came down to realizing there was a hole in my knowledge and having Wikipedia at my fingertips, being able to start rectifying that. What got me kind of more seriously into researching history was in the mid-2000s when I was doing a research degree, I started to get more and more interested in the idea of YouTube and of the idea of doing something to do with history. I tried some other channels up until then that were like video game based, but they really didn't take off, and that's because the quality of the analysis and the content wasn't very good. But I got really into reading more and more into history because of that. But it took me it took me like half a decade to actually act on that. So I was reading all through my mid-20s. I was reading biographies of like various US presidents, various Russian leaders, kind of books on the Holy Roman Empire and early medieval France and England. So I was trying to kind of build up more of a knowledge so that I was prepared to do this. But eventually, I decided, push come to shove, let's just get it done, get a video out there. And yeah, I think it was kind of taking an interest and wanting to go more in the YouTube direction that really pushed me over the edge to try and develop my knowledge of history. But there was always an interest there, as I said for the earlier question. Okay, Autism420 asks, are there any history-focused YouTube channels you enjoy and would recommend? The problem is I know so many history-based YouTube channels now, I'd probably follow most of them on Twitter, so yeah. If you go to twitter.com/the_histocrat and just go on my following list, you'll probably find, 30 or so great channels to follow. To throw out a few names, I would say probably the first one which comes to mind, like every person who I've seen ever do a Q&A like this, is probably Stefan Milo. So his YouTube channel's really good for like early evolutionary history of humanity, like early Neolithic coverage. He did a really great interview with one of the archaeologists who's currently excavating at Göbekli Tepe recently. I rewatched that a whole bunch of times when it came to me putting together my Birth of Civilization video, but he also did a whole bunch of earlier stuff as well that I enjoyed. So yeah, check out Stefan Milo. In terms of content that's structured a bit more like mine, I would probably suggest something like History Time. He's really good at getting stuff out at a much better rate than I do, and doing long-form, in-depth documentaries on all sorts of niche topics on history, and also doing some more general topics as well. If you want something else along those lines, I'd probably also recommend Fire of Learning. I think when I was deciding if I wanted to make history videos, he was actually a big influence on me, particularly his History of England series almost directly led to my History of Britain series. So yeah, check those guys out. Any other names to throw out there that I've enjoyed recently? I enjoyed the Dollop podcast. That's pretty good. It's like a humorous American history podcast that's presented by a couple of actual comedians. It's not the cringeworthy jokes I try to do on my podcast. They're a little ad heavy these days, so maybe skip past the first 4 or 5 minutes of most of their podcasts. But yeah, I'd recommend the Dollop. There's too many others to really name. Let's shout out some small channels. Mythology Guy, Step Back History is pretty good. I don't know why I called him a small channel. Basically anyone except M Laser History. Okay. Halsey Wolsey Woo, it's a great name, asks, if you could choose, which ancient civilization would you live in? So I did actually have a bit of a think about this one, because I've read a lot about early farming communities, a lot about medieval communities, and they all sound pretty horrible to actually have to live in terms of like hygiene, contaminated water sources, disease, etc. So on thinking about it, I would probably go back and be a hunter-gatherer, like maybe somewhere in Eurasia around 20,000 BCE, and I think that would actually be a lot nicer than being an early farmer. So you'd have a lot more leisure time, you didn't have such a back-breaking style of producing all your food, and yeah, that's just what it comes down to, is more leisure time, less likely to live in a horrible early settlement, less likely to deform your skeleton and back by using the primitive tools of farming and grinding grain into flour. You're probably more likely to die in a hunting accident as a result, but we generally have good evidence that the skeletons of early hunter-gatherers were better nourished, larger, and just generally seem to have had a better lifestyle. And it's really probably down to the fact that farming just could have such a higher carrying capacity for calories compared with hunter-gatherers that it eventually won out. So yeah, hunter-gatherer. Amy Monroe asks, with so many ancient civilizations having a flood myth, do you think that they are remembering one horrific flood which made a global impact, several localized but still traumatic floods, or one localized flood whose survivors scattered to several regions? I think it could be a combination of the second two, basically. So, several localized but still traumatic floods. I read an article a little while ago that I will try and dig up and put in the description that looked at the idea that the Sumerian flood myth and the later Babylonian version of that myth may have been influenced by a major flood somewhere in either the 4th or early 3rd millennium BCE in southern Iraq. And the basic consensus that I could find was, whilst there are flood sediments showing that settlements during some of this time frame would have been flooded, the sediments at different sites differed from one another in terms of dating. So to me, it's probably more a case that early agricultural societies were based very much around rivers and irrigation, and just needing them around to have a source of drinking water. So I would think it's probably a localized flooding, and just the fact that flooding is such a feature of early agricultural societies in Mesopotamia and Egypt that probably influenced those mythologies in that direction. The reason I say that it could be a combination as well of that latter point is there usually is a degree of flood mythology in Indo-European based cultures, and that's probably because of some localized flooding event in the Proto-Indo-European homeland before things kind of spread out. So people moved from the area just north of the Black Sea through to parts of Western Europe, down into India, and even further across into Siberia, and possibly down into the Near East. So yeah, that's my answer. Is I think it was localized flooding, possibly spread by just migration later on, similar to the chaos camp of Indo-European mythology. Anderson Fremin asks, what is a historical fact that genuinely surprised you upon learning it? I think probably the fact that surprised me when I was early on and learning just a little bit more about history was that the Romans, in terms of world civilizations, are not really amongst the earliest. We had a couple of millennia of different nations and states in the Near East. China appeared earlier in terms of things like the Shang dynasty and I think the Chou dynasty. So, the fact that Rome received such a preponderance of attention in the Western narrative around history, that surprised a little bit that they weren't kind of the progenitor civilization, so to speak. For a while, I actually thought that Rome was the world's first city, so that did surprise me learning. Many of the methods that Rome used are older. They were probably just the most successful out of everyone for a long period of time, and the unprecedented scale of their empire probably is a result of that as a whole. So yeah, the idea that Rome didn't originate a lot of the concepts that led to its empire's success, but were just probably the best at using that model that had been used by places like the Persian Empire and earlier. Ding Dong asks, which period of British history do you think is most interesting? Also, congrats on the almost 75,000 subs. Oh, thank you, Ding Dong. Okay, so most interesting period of British history. For me, it's always going to be either prehistory, because we have only archaeological remains to fall back on. We have very little in the way of written sources up until kind of the earliest interactions between Greek explorers and Romans with northwestern Europe. However, I would probably actually say, for similar reasons, I think Anglo-Saxon England is probably the most interesting time period, and I'm really looking forward to covering it when I get to that point on the history of Britain. The reason simply being that we just don't know a huge amount about the peoples who migrated over from kind of where the modern Netherlands, northern Germany, and Denmark are. We don't really know who their leaders were, so there's a lot of accounts that claim they were led by two brothers named Hengist and Horsa, but it's now looking more likely that those two individuals actually weren't historical. They were mythical figures who were just prominent within the mythologies of those areas that later came to be kind of immortalized as figures and historicized as a result. So yeah, early Anglo-Saxon England, that's really a cool period to me because it's just so uncertain. Okay, Nick K asks, what were some early sources or moments that you can remember that really sparked an interest for you to study history? I remember watching Robin Hood Prince of Thieves when I was younger, went through 2 VHS tapes. I watched it so much. I actually watched that film a lot as a kid as well, simply because we managed to tape it at one point, and it's Robin Hood. It seemed a lot cooler than the Disney version at the time because it seemed more historically grounded. You had Alan Rickman in there being incredibly hammy, Morgan Freeman, that sort of thing, and Kevin Costner's terrible English accent. That was quite entertaining. Early sources then. The problem really is for me is that I didn't have that much interest in history until I was older. So any sources of early inspiration, they would have to be very subconscious. So things like obviously Disney's Robin Hood, which is incredibly non-historical and doesn't pretend to be. But, I think maybe some early fantasy books may have made me more interested in history, not necessarily, human history, but just world building and history associated with that sort of thing. I was one of the rare people who actually read the Silmarillion. I have it up here because I wanted to know more about Tolkien's world. So, my early influences on history were not for human history. So, yeah, sorry if that's a bit of a cop-out answer. I don't have a huge number to say outside of, being interested in some fantasy novels and also Wikipedia dives as a teenager. Okay, Samuel Glaze asks, what's your favourite bit of historical trivia / favourite historical fun fact? If you had to pick just one. Just one. Ooh, okay. I think probably my favourite one that I saw was whilst I was researching the Druids video, I came across the death of Heraclitus, which, according to Diogenes Laertius, I can never remember how to pronounce his surname, was that Heraclitus suffered from dropsy, so he decided to smear himself with cow manure to cure his dropsy, and was promptly eaten by a pack of dogs. Yes. Okay, Brian McLeod asks, which civilization / time period was the one that got you hooked? The first one? Oh, that's a good one. I would probably say something like the Holy Roman Empire was the first civilization or nation that I really got interested in reading about in detail. So from its origins in the era of Charlemagne, the kind of Frankish Empire of those times, through to the reunification of Germany and Italy under Otto the Great. That really got me hooked in terms of reading. I was tossing up when I made the idea of doing a History of Britain series. I almost went for going for the Holy Roman Empire instead, and I may well still do that one day. I think in the Voynich manuscript deep dive, I said I wanted to do a video on the 30 Years' War. I'm going to put that in my patrons list next time for when they're voting on a subject, and hopefully I won't take 6 months to get to this one, so apologies for how long my Birth of Civilization video is taking. But yes, Holy Roman Empire. Aitkins8 asks, does the Neolithic period interest you, and would you ever do a video on the Indus Valley and migration from Africa? You're going to enjoy my next video, Aitkins8, because it's almost entirely on the Neolithic and some of the early Copper Age. So watch out for that, it'll probably be done in about the next 3 weeks or so. But yes, is the simple answer. I'm going to be covering most of the Neolithic over the course of that video. I already covered the Neolithic in my History of Britain video series at one point, and I also would like to do a follow-up to my Birth of Civilization video maybe next year or so, where I would look at the Indus Valley civilization as part of kind of its trade with the nations of Sumeria. As for migration from Africa, I'm certain that'll come up at some point as well, so just, given enough time, I'm certain I'll cover it. I think Stefan Milo has already covered it as well, so maybe go and have a look across his channel. He might have something as well to keep you sated whilst I take several years to make something. Cyanide77 asks, would you cover the identity of William Shakespeare, i.e. was he a real person or not? Fascinating rabbit hole like the Voynich manuscript. William Shakespeare is an interesting one, simply because there are a lot of conspiracy theories that either he wasn't a real person, he was kind of used as a catch-all for a bunch of other plays, or he did exist, but another playwright was behind the plays and he took credit for them. To the best of my knowledge, there isn't really anything substantial to the conspiracy theories. William Shakespeare almost certainly existed. What muddies the water a little bit is that I don't think we have an authentic portrait of him from life that's been definitely shown to be representative. I think the engraving of him on the first folio was considered a good likeness by people who knew him. But, Shakespeare appeared on different playbills throughout his life. There were other versions of his plays published during his lifetime. And, yeah, I think what really brings the uncertainty up was that the first folio wasn't published until after his death. So I'd be happy to try and look into them and see if there's an interesting kind of maybe a set of something we could cover as part of mythological, as more of like a modern myth. It's not really modern, but along those lines. But I don't think I would ever really want to make a dedicated video on the topic unless it was like, here is the life of William Shakespeare. And yeah, Shakespeare isn't really a topic that interests me that much, I must admit. He's kind of like, I was forced to learn some of his plays as a kid, but I've never really gone back to them as an adult out of genuine interest, so maybe I need to do that, and maybe that's something that I could look into in the future. Jim Bob asks, what sparked your interest in cartography? Does your background in cartography stem from professional and/or academic/educational experience? And thanks for the great videos, keep it up. Oh, thank you, Jim Bob. I have no professional experience whatsoever in cartography. My dad really likes road ordnance maps, so that's about the closest I'm going to get. But the answer is, I kind of used a lot of the early maps in my videos simply because, I felt there wasn't a better way of representing the topic without showing, the geographical borders of nations that I was mentioning, or the series of events to do with wars. So, yeah, I would not say I have any professional interest, but what I would say is things like, let me find them. So, early fantasy novels were a big influence on me in terms of just enjoying maps, for the simple reason that many of them, and I have my extremely threadbare now copy of The Hobbit, many of them would have simple maps in the front of it, and I really enjoy that in a story where you can kind of visualize the event as taking place in a real place. And yeah, this sort of thing early on, so you got, here is like Mirkwood, Desolation of Smaug, the Grey Mountains, Lonely Mountain, that really probably turned me on to having more of an interest in maps and just, making something feel more real when you can relate it back to the particular countries and the geographical dimensions. So I got another example here, which is just, another fantasy book just showing you, they often have very detailed maps in the front, and I used to really like just going back and poring over every little detail in them. It's also fun because you can kind of track seeing where authors then later kind of decided, ooh, this is going to be part of my universe. But this is the map from the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. Check that out. She's a great novelist, probably my favourite fantasy writer. But yeah, that sort of thing probably could have been an early influence as well. In terms of the resources I've used to make maps for my YouTube channel, I've mostly gone by either maps that people have put on Wikipedia. So there's a lot of maps that people have just made and put up for free based on either earlier historical maps or descriptions of territory that nations owned. So I've used a lot of those for reference points. I've also used the YouTube channels Emperor Tiger Star and Ollie Bai, I think. They do like map content looking at changes over time. Okay, so we're coming into the home stretch now. So Coyote Ali asks, would you consider making an Instagram page? I love your channel so much, so happy to have found it. Oh, thank you, Coyote Ali. Sorry if I messed up your name there. I'm not sure is the answer when it comes to Instagram. I'm not really a person who takes a lot of pictures. I've put a couple of myself on my Twitter before just because I kind of wanted people to be able to put a bit of a face at least to the videos that are being made, but I just don't really know what I would do with an Instagram page. I struggled with Twitter when I started because I didn't really know what to put on there. For the first year or so, I literally just put up historical fact today, like this happened on X date in history. But maybe I could look into it. I just don't really think I have. Yeah, I don't have the creativity probably for it. I throw that all at YouTube. Okay, so final question. Freethought Domain asks, why were the Australian Indigenous people left in the Stone Age, even though they were trading with industrialised nations for hundreds of years before colonisation? Or were they? So I'm not really that knowledgeable when it comes to Aboriginal history in Australia, or really Australian history as a whole. I think there are much better people you could probably go to for that. But the impression I got was, I don't know if they were actually trading with industrialised nations that much. The impression I get between early interactions between, say, English settlers and Australia was it was less about, hey, let's trade with these people and bring them out of the Stone Age. So I think many of the various different Aboriginal nations in Australia at the time were either using a type of like subsistence, hunter-gatherer living, or early agriculture. I don't feel like the English colonists came over and said, you know, let's elevate the technological level of these people and pull them up and make them their own nation. I get the impression it was more a case of, this is our land now, get off. But I haven't really researched the topic in great detail, so apologies if that's completely wrong. And as I'd say, I would not ever claim to be an expert on that. But it is an interesting thing I should probably look into more. I just don't feel like I'm an expert in it fundamentally. And whilst I've not really started as an expert in any of the videos I've made, so like I was making the Voynich manuscript or the Druids videos, there was enough of a passion there that I knew how to get going on it. And things like that, I just don't feel like I'm the best person placed to do it. And I'd have to find some really unique angle towards it. So, but yeah, thank you for the question though. Okay guys, so hopefully that was interesting. I don't think I'm going to be making many more of these kind of on-camera videos anytime soon. I actually bought this more so that I could go away and do some location shooting using the camera. But due to the present circumstances in most of the world anyway, I haven't had any opportunity really to do that. I think I'm probably going to try and do it for a history of Britain, the Roman invasion. Just kind of go around England and find different Roman era sites and just kind of put some footage together. And I think possibly go to Hadrian's Wall as well and do some shooting there. So look out for that sort of thing more on the channel in the future. But I kind of want to keep it a bit faceless when it comes to the main videos. I don't really want to put myself front and center just because it's not really a personality based channel. And I feel like that could distract it for some people. So yeah, apart from that, look out for a new episode of Mythological coming in the next week or so. It's going to be on King Arthur. And next video will be the birth of civilization. Outside of that, if you want to support the channel a little bit, you can go over to Twitter and see what I'm rambling about there. I am twitter.com/the_histocrat. And if you want to support the channel further, maybe head over to Patreon. I am currently using any proceeds I receive from your pledges there to try and improve just the production level of my channel. I bought some lights, I bought an overhead mic setup using that fund recently, and I've also been using it to buy the illustrations that you've probably seen both in the last History of Britain episode, and there's going to be a whole bunch of those in the upcoming Birth of Civilization episode. So yeah, apart from that, I just want to say guys, thank you again for the 75,000, almost 80,000 subs now as I record this. It's just absolutely incredible. I had no idea that there was such kind of a thirst out there for this type of historical content, and I'm eternally grateful to you guys. Thank you all, and yeah, I'll talk to you again real soon. Goodbye.